Okie dokie. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Farminar. I am Steve Carlson. I'm a staff member at Practical Farmers of Iowa, and I'll be sort of the host tonight. Tonight's Farminar topic, as you probably know, is getting more with cover crops. And I guess you can say this is probably intended for those growers who are a little bit more comfortable with basic cover crop usage and are maybe ready to try some new options. So tonight we've got PFI member Jack Boyer, who's been conducting on-farm research for several years, and we'll hear from him regarding a handful of these cover crop projects that he's been involved in. And then also with us tonight is ISU agronomy researcher Mike Castellano, whose research focuses on biogeochemical cycling and transport within the soil. And he'll talk about his recent research on cover crops, which is some of it similar to what Jack has been doing. So before I turn it over to Jack and then to Mike, I'm going to speak real quick about Practical Farmers of Iowa and our Farminar series. So this is part of our fall Farminar series. We started back in mid-November, and next week is actually the final topic of this fall series. And we cover a wide variety of topics in cover crops and field crops and livestock and horticulture. Next week is a farm life balance for CSA farmers. But stay tuned, especially if you're on our Farminar email list for an announcement about the winter Farminar series, which starts again on January 10th. And we're going to have 14 more topics coming up starting January 10th. So stay tuned to the Practical Farmers website and on our email list for that announcement. A lot of cover crop topics coming up. So if you're interested in this one, there'll be a few more for you this fall. Also, if you miss any of our Farminars, we do record these and we put them in our archive at practicalfarmers.org. There are over 100 in our archives now, and so on a cold night like this, if we're not doing a Farminar, you can check that archive and find something you're probably interested in. So Practical Farmers of Iowa started back in 1985 as a nonprofit organization made up of farmers who were interested in reducing inputs and using on-farm research to provide answers to their specific on-farm questions. And today we're still really focused on the same kinds of issues that we were back in 1985. And now we're made up of farmers from all enterprises and farms of all sizes, and not just focused on farms in Iowa either. So those of you who are from out of state, this should be interesting for you as well. We do a lot of work in Iowa, but work with a lot of farmers outside of Iowa as well. Also, in our membership, we have a lot of friends of farmers who support our mission as well. So we've really grown to be a large, diverse farming organization. And our mission at Practical Farmers is to strengthen farms and communities through farmer-led investigation and information sharing. And this mission allows us to help farmers practice an agriculture that benefits both the land and the people. Our values at PFI: welcoming everyone, creativity, collaboration, and community, viable farms now and for future generations, and stewardship and ecology. As I said, we are a member-based organization, so I encourage you to join us. Membership allows you to tap into our network of members, which is really the greatest benefit, is being a part of this group of PFI members who are doing on-farm research and willing to share about it. And you get access into our email discussion lists where you can pose your production or business related questions to other farmers and get some feedback. Membership also gets you our newsletters, our quarterly newsletters, discounts to our events, and opportunities to participate in PFI research projects like what Jack Boyer, our first speaker tonight, is involved with. So check out more membership information on our website. I encourage you to join us. Also on our website is an event calendar, and this time of year we do these Farminars every Tuesday night. We'll take a couple weeks off around Christmas, but aside from our Farminars, there are still a lot of other events happening, so check the calendar for something in your area. And speaking of events, the granddaddy of events from PFI is our annual conference, which is January 20th and 21st this year. It's always in Ames at the ISU campus. And we've just released our booklet, which lists the more than 50 sessions that we've got planned throughout that weekend. And again, a lot of cover crop topics, a lot of soil health sessions, So definitely go to the website and check out all of those sessions and make a point to come to Ames and join us for this really great conference happening the 20th and 21st of January. So then, real quick, like I said, if you want to stay in touch with PFI's Farminars, you can pop your email address in the chat box there, and I'll put you on our list. We just send a weekly email this time of year while we're doing these Farminars, give you a heads up about what's coming up this week. Also, it's fun to see where people are tuning in from. Like I said, I'm in Ames. I know Mike Castellano is on the other side of town here in Ames. Jack up in Rhinebeck, which is Grundy County. It's fun to see where folks are tuning in from. And if you haven't noticed this already, down on the lower left corner of your screen, there is a little poll. We just try to get a head count of how many people are watching these Farminars live. So check that box in your poll. If there's a couple of you watching from one computer, let us know that so we get kind of an accurate count of who's tuning in. So the chat box looks like people have kind of figured that out. That's where, if you have any questions for our presenters, please put those in the chat box, and you can type them in at any time. And if Jack and Mike see your question and they're able to answer it at that time, they'll answer it. But if not, don't worry, I'll make sure that we circle back to go through the questions that were missed during the final 30 minutes. So we'll let Jack speak for about 30 minutes, then let Mike speak for about 30 minutes, and then do questions for the remaining 20, 25 minutes. One final thing, at the near the end of the Farminar, I'm going to put a link up on the screen to take a survey and give us a little feedback about tonight's Farminar, but also that's an opportunity for you to tell us what topics you want to hear about in the future, and we really take that feedback seriously. So do take just a really quick minute at the end of tonight's Farminar to give us a little feedback. That would be appreciated. So now I'm going to pull up Jack's presentation here and then let Jack get started. So thanks again for tuning in tonight.
Let me know when you're ready, Steve.
All right, yep, we're ready to go when you are.
Good evening. Jack Boyer, and maybe just a little bit about the farm before we get started. This is a farmstead that I currently live on, and it's a century farm. It was initially settled by my wife's grandparents, and so we feel like we've got a legacy to try to pass on, and we want to take care of the farm as we continue what is our use while we have it in our lifetime. So anyway, this evening I'll plan to give a little bit of an update on a termination date versus soybean yield, and then I also grew some of my own cereal rye for seed this year and experimented with a plant growth regulator and did a trial on that, and I've been experimenting with interseeding in V4 to V6 corn. This year it happened to be in seed corn, so maybe if time allows, we'll do an update on that project. So maybe this is my second year of the cover crop termination date, and so backing up into last year, you can see the early termination, kind of the crop, the height of the cereal rye. In this particular field happened to be cereal rye only, and so it was terminated. And then this was about 9 or 10 days before planting. And then the second termination was done just a day after planting. So you can kind of see the height of the crop when I was actually planting in it. Here's the tractor, see going through that. And I tell folks last year when I did this, it was kind of an emotional event driving through that for the first time planting in green cover crop. So it's been an experience, but I got away with it and looked okay. Anyway, moving on as the season progressed in 2015, did stand counts. There was no difference in the stand counts between having an early termination, no cover at all, or a late termination. They all worked out about the same as far as the cover the stand counts rather, and so there was no difference in that. But as you can kind of see, these pictures were all taken on the same day, but the amount of green in them is quite a bit different. In this no cover, there was a lot more weeds in that. The green you see there is not soybeans. It was resistant water hemp and mare's tail. So anyway, that was. I tell folks a lot of these experiments that I run, I learn more by accident than I do on purpose. And I really wasn't looking for this, but it was quite an observation. So that. So anyway, I sprayed those no cover areas and with the chemical in the application using Iowa State's custom rates. It figured it cost about $40 an acre for that herbicide treatment with application. And anyway, in the fall, went in and harvested them, and there was no significant difference in any of the treatments. No cover, early, late. There was no significant difference in the yield. So summarizing, in that particular year, the cover crop there was just cereal rye, and again using Iowa State's figures for the application part of it, plus whatever the seed cost I had in it, so it cost me about $30. Where I had the cover crops, didn't have to do that herbicide, so that was $40. So that was $10 in my pocket. This is a little bit of a side story here on this, is that when various programs or from the NRCS and others that tell you to put down so many so many pounds of seed, I ask you to be a little bit cautious about that, because not all pounds are created equal. As you can see here on the left, this was a variety not stated of cereal rye, and on the right was an Elbon variety of rye. And I did a little test, counting up the seeds and weighing them and calculating it all up. And so there's like 880,000 seeds per acre using that one, using 56 pounds to the acre, and almost 1.4 million on the other. So you want to pay attention to seed size as you are planting your cover crops to and look at the different varieties, and particularly when you get in mixes, to try to get the proper seeds or seed count on the ground. So moving on to 2016, repeating that test in a different field, but these stripes that you see across this field were the early terminated, and the rest of the field was terminated late. I didn't have any no cover strips this year for comparison purposes. Looking at the early emergence of the thing, the early versus the late, again, there was no difference in the stand counts. You had to look a little harder in that late because there's a whole lot more biomass, but when you dug them out, it was within, there was no significant difference in the stand counts. Also, as part of this year's project, I took a look at the soil temperature and the soil water content as this cover crop was coming up. They took both on May 8th. This was shortly after it was planted, or about the time it was planted, and then on up in midsummer. And looking through this, there's no significant difference in the temperatures between the two treatments in that. But when you get to the water content in the soil, the early termination had more water in it than did the late. So there was a lot, the late, that rye continued to grow, continued to take moisture out of the soil. But we had quite a bit of rain in June, and so by July, they had caught up such that there was no difference in them again. Looking at the biomass between early and late, the late, it almost doubled in the amount of biomass produced just in that short period of time. Looking at the yield, again, there was no significant difference in early terminated versus late terminated yield in this particular test. And I might mention this report is on the PFI website if you go into the research papers. And Jeremy Gustafson over in the Boone area of Iowa, he was also running this same test and had similar results. Another thing that I noticed, this is a different field, but I wound up another one of these deals that I learned by accident. I was out looking at these fields one day, and I saw these straight lines. And this particular field is the early spring, and it was planted perpendicular to these gaps that are in here. But these gaps were created by heavy residue on the ground when I had the field aerial seeded, and so the seeds landed on that heavy residue mat, and the seeds didn't get to the ground, so I really didn't get much of a stand, and then this was terminated. But anyway, moving on, as the crop grew, I saw these stripes in the field, and this was it. These brown stripes that you see here is SDS that was in this crop. And where there was heavy cover crop when I killed it last spring, there was less cover crop in that. And anyway, I had some conversation with the plant pathology lab at Iowa State, and also some with Illinois. And apparently, there has been some research done that was showing there is some benefits to reducing SDS with cover crops. They had worked with oats and cereal rye and had seen some benefit with both. My original thought is because at the time these were planted, it was relatively wet, and where the heavier cereal rye was, it took more moisture out of the soil. But the folks at the plant pathology lab in Iowa State and Illinois said that, yes, that is a big part of it, but there's more to it than that. Okay, so that was kind of the results of and some of the learnings I had from that termination study. Going on to the cereal rye, this was my first experience at trying to grow my own seed, and as this was growing up, it actually I didn't put the date down here where I actually took the picture, but this cereal rye got to be more than 6 feet tall, and so that it created a lot of biomass. The plant growth regulator was really trying to investigate would it be beneficial to try to reduce lodging in small grains, in my particular case in cereal rye, and at least in this particular year, we didn't have any particular high winds that created the lodging problem, so I wasn't able to observe a difference in that regard. But there wasn't any difference in the height at harvest, but there was a difference in the biomass with the non-treated had a little more biomass than did that I had with the plant growth regulator. And so it seems that it was having some effect on the plant, even though I couldn't observe it just from a visual standpoint. Okay, and in the cereal rye, with and without the plant growth regulator, there was not any significant difference in the yield. I had 5 reps, and looking at the means, there was no difference between the means, but there was some difference as you went across the different reps, but in the end, there was not a significant difference in the yield between the two. So it came across very good. Okay, I wanted to spend just a minute talking about the economics of growing cereal rye. I grow seed corn, and as part of the seed corn process, if you have any commercial corn growing around you, you have to isolate away from that. Normally, I would plant soybeans in those areas, in those isolation areas, but this year, with the price of soybeans being where they were and what I'd been having to pay for cereal rye seed more recently, I decided, and I had a good stand in that area of cereal rye, I decided to let it go to seed. And so, turns out that worked out pretty good for me. Uh, at this particular analysis, I said, well, I've still got to clean the seed, so I've been paying $12 for the seed, or sometimes a little more. And so I just said, okay, it was worth $10 because I used all of this seed back on my own farm. And if you use that price, and at the time I made my decision, soybeans was a little over $8 a bushel. But in the end, the net income, was about 7 times with the cereal rye than it would have been with the soybeans. And so it turned out pretty well for me this year. However, I throw a caution in there. You need to know what your rye market is, because there's not, at least here in Iowa, there's not much a market for rye seed, cereal rye, except for cover crop. And so you can get overloaded there pretty quick if you're not careful. But I was able to use all that I grew, so that worked out for me. Okay, moving on a little bit into the seed corn interseeding, and this I want to skip that one. Let's see. Okay, what this was is that going in and planting, I had 2 different mixes that were provided by Albert Lee Seed House, and I had 2 different mixes that were broadcast into the production seed corn when that corn plant was at about V4. And this I replicated it with 4 reps with each mix, so I had 8 strips across the field, and I had a no cover crop strip between each one of those strips for a baseline. These are the mixes that I had. The CC2 was it had the annual ryegrass, so it only had 4 species in it. The other one had the 6 species. It too had annual ryegrass, but it had an extra clover, some lentils, radish, and purple top turnips. And one of the my major objectives for doing this is that I'd had previous experience in 15 trying this with just cereal rye. It was in commercial corn though, and my cereal rye didn't survive the canopy shading it out. So I was trying to find out some different varieties that might survive that. Seed corn's a different animal. It doesn't get near as tall, doesn't have near the canopy, and so I got different results as well. As it turns out, everything survived, and I guess that wasn't terribly unexpected, but I wanted to try it and see what I could learn out of it anyway. Harvested the biomass just before frost this year. It was early November, and when this was harvested anyway, and there was no significant difference in the amount of biomass created or any of the attributes that we measured on it. The intent of this is that we will let it go through the winter. The brassicas and clovers and those will not overwinter. The annual ryegrass, that's another objective I had, is I was hoping that if I got the ryegrass started earlier, it got a more established root, maybe I could get it over winter. They have some success at doing that south of US 30, but I've tried it a number of years and have never gotten it to overwinter. So that was another observation I hope to be able to make from this. This is kind of some pictures of what it looked like about a month after it was planted. The main plants that you can really see while it was shaded were the brassicas, and here's kind of a close-up of it. The turnips and the radishes really took off, but you can see some of the annual ryegrass in there. And then after it was harvested, then the clovers and the annual ryegrass really took off then, and so you could see they got more light and they took off. Um, Looking at the seed corn yield of having that cover crop in there, there was no significant difference in the yield of the seed corn. And my seed corn company was participating with this research project, and they actually harvested the ears and did the analysis for themselves. And so I felt real good when the seed corn company comes back and says having that cover crop in there did not cause a significant yield change in that field.
Yeah, I think
Okay, so
Jack.
I'm
Yeah, go for it.
going to give Mike lots
Take
of
Tom's
time, I guess.
question there
But
if you
as
could.
far as the seed corn, there was no yield difference, and all the species survived. And so, if there's questions, I don't know. I wasn't watching the chat box. I don't know if there was any questions came through there or not. Okay, here's one. Yes, uh, yeah. How was the cover crop seeded? This particular year, I seeded it with a. I just had a I call them a cyclone seeder, but it's a spinner seeder that I had it mounted on the back of my gator and made the passes up there to create these strips. I did not incorporate them, so they got the rain and uh, and germinated good, so that worked out. Last year, I had a what I think consider a better process. I had an air seeder mounted on the top of my anhydrous toolbar, and so when I did my side dressing, I seeded the cover crop at the same time. So that was how this particular year was done, and last year. Question on the herbicide program. I guess I'm not going to be able to get it off the top of my head, but anyway, what I did look at is that Pennsylvania State had put out some data looking at the half-lives of various herbicides, and I did look for herbicides that had a relatively short life, but I had a residual down there, but the other chemical that used this seed corn happened to be Liberty tolerant, and so Liberty was sprayed on there just before I seeded the cover crop, and so there was not any chemical interference with it. Another question, did I have? Oh, back to the cover crop or termination deal. Having any problems planting into the cereal rye? Um, I used the 1560 John Deere no-till drill, and this being my second year working on that, I did find that I had to apply more down pressure to be sure and get down through that mass. But other than that, I had zero problems. The crop flowed through the no-till drill just fine. There was no issues with that at all, and it got along just fine. Let's see, soybean population, and I was planting 150,000 is what I was seeding with the soybeans. Penn State appears to be on the webinar. Bill Curran. Okay, that's good. That that is one of the names that I on the papers that I was looking at and using. So that's I appreciated the information. And what is your take on transferring this experience to field corn? Um, I intend to run another test next year with this, and I'm going to look at varieties of corn that has a more open architecture versus the canopy that has more closed. I've worked with a seed dealer and trying to find varieties that has that allow more light to come down through. And I'll be looking both at, does that different architecture cause me any yield difference, but also does it allow the light to come down through and allow that cover crop to survive? And I will be measuring
Great.
the light
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll
intensity.
see if
I found some
Michael V
sensors that
has
I
a.
can put in there,
Okay,
and
yeah,
I'll be
maybe one
measuring the
more
light
question for
intensity
Michael
that
before
actually
we
gets
pull
to the
up
cover crop,
Mike's.
just because I'm curious, I guess. Uh, okay, I think that's the questions I see for now. Okay. any issues with the brassicas shading out the legumes in any areas of the field. I was concerned about that early on because you just didn't the legumes were those clovers were really
Excellent.
small and
Yeah, thank
hanging
you,
down
Jack.
there, and the
So of
brassicas were
course, if you
really
got more
getting
questions
large.
for Jack Boyer, he'll
And
be sticking
but
around,
in
and we'll
the end,
do
after I harvested
questions
it and it had a few days of
once
sight.
Mike's up here in about 30 minutes. So now we'll let Mike take it over with discussing his research.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Jack. Very interesting presentation. And I think a lot of the results today that I'll show will complement Jack's work at more of a plot type scale, measuring some of the fluxes of nitrogen in the system and some of the biomass production we got from the rye cover crop, and thinking about more the system, how the whole system comes together to promote cover crop growth and function in the corn and soybean cropping system in Iowa. One of the really exciting things that I heard Jack talk about at the end of his presentation is working on more open canopy architecture for corn. Those are exactly the type of things that we're thinking about. Small little tweaks to the system when we put the cover crop in that we can get disproportionately large benefits from. So those are some of the types of things I'd like to think about, especially towards the end of my presentation today. So if we're going to think about cover crops and their success in the system, one of the things we're thinking about in Iowa, of course, is nitrogen and nitrogen retention. And so I'd like to start off with looking at a budget for nitrogen in the state. And so this is obviously a rough budget, but just a kind of a rough budget for nitrogen in a corn system in Iowa. And I want to highlight a couple of things. And so I want to draw your attention to this big green box on the left side of the slide. So it represents soil organic matter. So the nitrogen in soil organic matter, roughly in central Iowa, it'd be about 10,000 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So fertilizer application to corn following soybeans, about 150 pounds or 1.5% of the total nitrogen in the crop system. So it's really, a relatively small amount of nitrogen that's being applied to the crop in fertilizer. And complementary to that, I think what we see here in this arrow moving to the right to the nitrate pool in the soil from the soil organic matter is that every year we can count on microbes to naturally produce 100 to 400 pounds of nitrate nitrogen per acre per year from that soil organic matter stock that's in the soil. And then, of course, we have some microbial reuptake of that nitrogen. We have some leaching loss to below the root zone. And then we get nitrogen uptake by the corn, of course, and harvest. So harvest about 0.5 to 0.6 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So I want to look at a similar budget now for soybeans and think about how there's some similarities and differences in nitrogen dynamics in the corn and soybean system. So if we turn to soybeans here, the big similarity, of course, is we have just as much soil organic matter in the soil, that 10,000 pounds. Another surprising similarity is that the nitrate leaching to water is the same in corn and soybean crops, about 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And so what does that tell us right off the bat? It's the same in a corn crop that receives about 150 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer per year, and a soybean crop that receives very little, if any, nitrogen fertilizer per year. So it tells us that this flux of nitrogen from the organic matter that's produced by microbes is really the main contributor of nitrate loss from the system. So fertilizer management can be improved in some places and reduce nitrate losses, but really the main cause of nitrate losses from our crop systems in Iowa is this natural production of nitrate from the soil organic matter by microbes that occurs whether a crop is growing there or not. The microbes aren't doing it as a community service for our corn and soybeans. They're doing it for their own energy requirements there. So another thing I'd like to highlight here is that the soybean crop, so this is roughly for 52 bushels in Iowa. takes up about 230 pounds of nitrogen per acre. It only gets about 100 pounds of that nitrogen from atmospheric fixation, whereas it removes about a little over 3¼ pounds of nitrogen per bushel. And so for this 51 or 52 bushel per acre crop, about 165 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year are harvested. And so that results in a nitrogen deficit in the soybean crop. And so what does a nitrogen deficit mean to us as farmers and cropping systems folks, managers? It means that there's also a deficit of organic matter. So if we're running a negative nitrogen balance in our cropping system, we have to be running a negative carbon balance. And the reason is because the carbon that's stored in this big soil organic matter pool must have roughly 10 pounds of carbon per acre to hold on to 1 pound of nitrogen per acre. We can't hold on to this nitrate, of course, because it's too soluble. So just adding more fertilizer to the system can't offset a negative nitrogen balance. It's got to be paired with some organic matter input to hold on to it, to the soil in the long term. So where can we get that organic matter from? Cover crops, of course, is one source, right? So cover crops, they're planted at times of the year when corn and soybeans aren't growing, as we all know, and they retain some of that nitrogen in the soil, some of that nitrate that otherwise might leach from the system. And to provide a rough idea of how that works, soybean they basically take up this nitrogen from the microbial production when there's no crop there to take it up. So I just want to go into this soybean nitrogen deficit real quickly here, because I think when I talk about this, it often strikes people by surprise, this idea that the nitrogen harvested in soybean grain exceeds the amount from fixation. Because we often think about things like soybean nitrogen credits, the idea that we apply less nitrogen to corn following beans than corn following corn may be a result of the fact that fixation exceeds the nitrogen in grain harvest. But that actually occurs for other reasons that I won't discuss today. But so we made some measurements across the state, particularly in northwest Iowa and central Iowa the past couple of years. We're going to continue with these measurements in 2017. But we found pretty consistently that nitrogen harvested in grain, or nitrogen fixation rather, minus nitrogen harvested in grain is negative by roughly 40 to 60 kilograms of nitrogen per acre. That's like 35 to 55 pounds of nitrogen per acre. They're very, very similar, kilograms of nitrogen per hectare and pounds of nitrogen per acre. And so we've used some different methods to measure this, and we've done it at different places. It seems pretty consistent. We have colleagues in Michigan and Nebraska that are making the same measurements, and they're finding the same results, that nitrogen harvest in soybean grain exceeds nitrogen fixation. And so this is all the more reason, like Jack mentioned earlier on his Century farm, they're concerned with maintaining the soil for the long term and keeping the long-term integrity of that operation. Well, maintaining soil organic matter and offsetting nitrogen balances is a great place to start on maintaining that system. So if we move on here, just a few details about the nitrogen deficit being a carbon deficit. So we have this carbon and nitrogen in that soil organic matter that's covalently bound. And so when microbes eat the carbon, they mineralize the nitrogen. And that, of course, contributes to a fertilizer source for the corn, or a nutrient source for the corn, however we want to term it. And the organic carbon mineralization, the carbon leaves the system as carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so if the soil nitrogen stock is negative, so is the soil carbon stock. And that can't be offset by adding nitrogen fertilizer again, because you have to have that carbon along with the nitrogen to hold it in the system. So there are some exceptions. I'm thinking about inorganic fertilizer. Manure would be an exception here, because of course the manure, particularly bedded manures, bedded cattle manures, they add that carbon and nitrogen together. That would contrast with something like liquid swine manure, that has virtually no carbon and just nitrogen. That would act more like an inorganic fertilizer. So if we just think about the budget here again, I just want to highlight, the negative, the higher nitrogen harvest and fixation, and how do we deal with that. So the cover crop can enter, addresses a significant problem when nitrogen's being lost from the system in Iowa. This is when, just a picture of a time of the year when nitrogen's being lost from the system, when the soil's warm and wet and there's no crop growing. Again, the nitrogen loss from the system's got very little to do with mismanagement of nitrogen fertilizer and much more to do with the fact that there aren't plants there taking up the nitrate that's being produced by microbes during significant portions of the year. And so if we look at this on kind of a timeline aspect, here we have, just early spring on the left side here to the winter on the right side. And we have the rate of nitrate production from the soil organic matter in red by microbes, and the relative rate of nitrogen uptake by corn or soybeans in the green. And these gray shaded areas represent times of the year when the nitrate production by the microbes exceeds the nitrate production nitrate demand by the crop. And that's when nitrate is susceptible to loss from the system by precipitation events. And so we might imagine here in early March, the soil starts to warm up, that 50-degree threshold that we often hear about. We like to apply anhydrous ammonia or liquid swine manure when the soils are 50 degrees and cooling, because that's when microbes are really good at producing nitrate. They can do it at temperatures lower than 50 degrees, but it really slows down at that point, and there's less of a consideration there. But so the soil starts to warm up here in the early spring, and the crop hasn't been planted yet, right? And so the microbes are producing nitrate, but there's no crop there to take it up. And of course, that can happen in the fall as well. But we don't typically get as much nitrate loss in the fall because the soils are drier, and the microbes need moisture to create that nitrate from the soil organic matter. And then, of course, we need the moisture to drive it out of the profile below the rooting zone and to our waterways. So if we think about how could a cover crop work in this system to retain nitrogen in the system for future crop use, if we could think about planting a cover crop right around this period of the year, as Jack did, when the crops are starting to dry down. And so the crop gets seeded here. And so we have the cover crop depicted in this dashed green line. It gets rooted. It starts to grow here in the fall and take up some of that nitrate that otherwise might be lost from the system. Then it goes dormant in the winter. But then as we come back around to the early spring for next year's corn or soybean crop, as the soil warms up in the spring and the microbes start producing nitrate, the cover crop is already there and rooted, and it starts taking up nitrate at the same time. And so we can offset a significant portion of that nitrate loss. Now, of course, we've got to terminate the cover crop before we plant the corn or soybeans, and so that has a big effect on how much nitrate we can retain, and affected Jack's results on the early and late kill cover crop treatments. And I'll show some similar results here coming up. And so when we think about this, I want to highlight that nitrogen fertilizer management has the potential to reduce nitrate losses from Iowa crop systems by maybe 5 to 15%. Cover crops are much more effective because they really treat this period of time when there's no crop growing, but microbes are producing nitrate. And as a result, we can see here from the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy that cover crops are relatively effective at reducing nitrate losses. So here we have on average cover crops might reduce nitrate losses by 31%. And they can have a little bit of a negative impact on corn yield. I won't talk much about that today, but have a big reduction in nitrate loss. Another thing I want to note here is that reduction loss is highly variable. So the standard deviation around that 31% reduction on average is 29%. So in other words, that's saying there that Sometimes cover crops are reducing nitrate loss by 60%. Other times they're reducing nitrate loss by virtually nothing. And we think that has a lot to do with the amount of growth that cover crops provide. And that's where we're moving towards here. So really the importance of growing degree days for cover crop growth. So here we've got, here we have some of the factors that contribute to the ability to get growth out of your cover crops. And so really I'm talking about winter cereal rye in my presentation here exclusively. That's the main cover crop that's grown in Iowa, of course. Virtually, well, the vast majority of the cover cropped acres in Iowa would be winter cereal rye. And so here we have the USDA usual planting dates for corn and soybean in Iowa. And you'll notice that corn, April 25th to May 18th, whereas soybean is roughly 2 to 3 weeks later, May 8th to June 2nd here. In addition to that later planting date for soybean, where you have extra growing degree days, extra time for a cover crop to grow before you have to terminate it and plant that corn or soybean crop, the recommended cover crop termination date before corn is 10 to 14 days before planting, whereas soybean, as you saw with Jack's presentation, just 1 day before planting. Some people are planting into standing cover crops, and so you can really delay the termination of that cover crop in the soybean. As a result, when you take the sum of these two factors, you can get significant amounts of time for the cover crop to grow extra before soybean versus corn planting. And adding to that, I'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Growing degree days, of course, they accumulate exponentially in the spring. So in other words, you get much more cover crop growth April 7th through 14th as you would April 1st through April 7th, just because it's getting warmer and warmer every day. So I want to demonstrate some results from some research we've done the past couple of years at Iowa State on cover crops and nitrogen retention and biomass production based on termination date before soybean. And so I want to just introduce kind of the treatments we have here. So we have 6 treatments in our experiment. We have corn and a corn-soybean rotation with no cover crop, corn and the corn bean rotation with the cover crop, and the cover crop's terminated about 14 days before corn planting. And then we also have 2 of these treatments because they're flipped with the soybean every year. So here we've got the soybean phase of the rotation with no cover crop. Here we have the soybean phase of the rotation with the cover crop, but the cover crop is terminated roughly 30 days before soybean planting because it's terminated on the same day that we terminate the cover crop before the corn planting. Then we have another soybean cover crop treatment where it's terminated just the day before the soybean planting with glyphosate. So all the terminations done with glyphosate here, and so we have those 2 differences in cover crop growth. And so I'm just going to show a few pictures of the experiment to give everybody an idea of what we're doing here. So we're seeding the cover crop into standing corn and soybeans using a high clearance spreader here, and you can see the cover crop coming up in the standing corn and the standing beans there. And then we have a photo here of the termination treatments. So the left was, both these are going into soybeans. The left was terminated early, and the right is going to be terminated late there. And so you can get an idea side by side of the difference in biomass accumulation. I'll show the numbers here in a minute. And then just a photo of seeding the soybeans into that cover crop. So it's sprayed with glyphosate just the day before, so of course it hasn't browned down yet. And then just another photo. So in these late terminations, the rye cover crop in the past couple warm spring and falls we've had here in Iowa is starting to head out here. So here are some of the data from the experiments. So these are from 2015 here. So here we've got the rye biomass production with the 4 on two sampling dates. So this April 15th sampling date is the day before we terminated the rye going into the corn. So we planted the corn roughly May 1st here, about 14 days after, the very end of April. And then here on May 11th, we've got the termination date, the late termination date, just a day before planting soybean. So we're planting soybean here on May 12th. And so you can see that we get a tremendous amount of extra cover crop growth in those 3 weeks or so. We go from just over 1,000 pounds of dry biomass per acre to over 5,000 pounds of dry biomass per acre. Right, so all these are planted on the same date in the fall, and just those extra 3 weeks results in almost 5 times the amount of biomass. So those spring periods of growth are really critical. So is the fall seeding, though, and I'm going to get to that here in a minute. So total nitrogen uptake, just to give you an idea of the amount of nitrogen that's accumulated in this cover crop here. So the early planting dates only, and this is just above ground, excluding the below ground biomass, but it's accumulating somewhere between 30 and 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And then in the late terminated cover crop, it's accumulating over 80 pounds in 2015 here. That's not to say that the difference in all this nitrogen would be leached from the system, or 30 to 40 pounds here would have been leached in the system if it wasn't accumulated by the cover crop. But certainly some significant portion of that nitrogen would have leached from the system if the cover crop wasn't there. And then the soybean yields. So just as Jack found, we had the same results here in 2015. So no difference between the early and late terminated cover crops here. No statistical difference in the yields. Maybe slightly numerically lower in the late terminated system, but I don't even think that is real, and we just didn't pick it up. And the 2016 results are consistent with that idea. So I want to get into the 2016 results here, and so these were really exciting. I saw Bill Curran from Penn State is on the webinar, a weed guy from Penn State, where I went to grad school, so that's exciting, because the results in 2016 were really interesting. So here's a photo from those same plots in 2016, and so here we have a soybean with no cover crop adjacent to a late terminated cover crop soybean. And you can see the difference in Roundup resistant water hemp between the two plots. So we had a really bad infestation of herbicide resistant water hemp. And I have the herbicide treatments we had here. So in 2016, in the early kill rye, we used glyphosate again. In the no rye, we used 2,4-D before planting the soybeans. Then in May 16th, with the late kill rye, we used glyphosate to terminate it. Then we planted the beans and used Optol, and we planted the beans at 140,000 seeds per acre. And then on July 6th, in all the treatments, we came back with Roundup and Cadet as herbicide treatments here. Just to give you an idea of the herbicide program, I'm not a weed guy, not really expert on herbicides by any stretch, but just to give you an idea that we weren't just letting the weeds grow in these plots. And so how did the rye biomass differ, and how did the subsequent soybean yields differ? So maybe here, instead of just having no effect of that extra cover crop biomass on the soybeans, maybe we got a real positive effect. So let's take a look at the data here. So here's the rye biomass here in 2016, no cover, early cover, late, thousands of pounds. We got almost 2,000 in the early, almost 5,000 in the late, and here are the soybean yields. So the soybean yields weren't spectacular in any of these treatments this year, and I'll go into some of the reasons why. But certainly it seemed that we had a very positive effect of that cover crop residue on the soybean or on the soybean yield there, and because of the weed suppression effect. So here's some of the negative, I think, why the bean yields were relatively low. So we had a lot of straw on the ground, and we got some hairpinning of seed there. So we didn't really do as good of a job as we should have in getting that seed. I know, maybe we're not sure what happened, but maybe the down pressure, some of those things, clearing the rows better. Some options we could explore in the future, but that was certainly one problem with the low yields across the board. And then I just want to highlight here again the importance of the growing degree days. So I just want to finish up thinking about growing degree days in terms of the success of a cover crop. So notice the growing degree days, they increase exponentially here in the spring. And so you get a lot more growth here during 1 week at this time of the year than you do at 1 week this time of the year is the point. And then in the fall as well, right? So they decline exponentially in the fall. And so it's really important to get that cover crop seeded early to get good growth from it. And I want to follow up with that with some simulation work we've done. And so we've taken these data and we're putting them into what we call agro-ecosystem cropping systems models. And I'll provide some of the links to the audience here. But these models allow you to explore scenarios and probabilities of what might happen based on cropping systems decisions that you make. And so here we've simulated in the model a fall planting date, 3 different fall planting dates. So the blue in September, the red in October, and the green in November. So September, October, and November 1st. So 3 differences in planting, 2 months difference in planting date. And then we have the same termination date on April 25th in all of them. And we can see the simulated rye biomass production and the nitrogen differences in nitrogen retention. And we can see here that getting that cover crop seeded, growing in the fall, not only does it affect how much biomass we produce in the fall, which is of no surprise, right? But it also, on the right side of this left graph here, when that cover crop wakes up in the spring and starts to take up the nitrogen, it does it much more efficiently because it got tillered in the fall. And that seemed to be a real key in this simulation model, was that if the cover crop got tillered in the fall, that the rate of nitrogen uptake and growth was much more rapid in the spring than when the cover crop didn't get tillered or it didn't even germinate in the case of the November 1 planting. And then, of course, again, if we have an October 15th planting on the right, as Jack and I both discussed, that April termination date has a big impact on biomass production and nitrogen retention in the system. And of course, we think, biomass, the production of biomass by the cover crop will ultimately benefit soil health in the long term. Certainly the amount of organic matter in the soil, it may be hard to measure on the short term, but over the long term, that'll build up and benefit the system. And then I just want to finish here by providing some links to some of the documents we have about these presentations here. And then in particular, I'd like to highlight this bottom link here, the Iowa State Cropping Systems tool. So this has forecasts and probability outputs for soybean planting decision date. So if you're planting a given, you can plug in a maturity group, you can plug in your planting date, and you can see the probability of reaching maximum yield. And so it can give you an idea. You can compare planting dates, maturity groups, so you can ask questions like, well, what if I delay my planting date by 10 days here with this maturity group? Am I going to lose any yield? If not, maybe I'll let my cover crop grow a little bit longer and get some more benefit from it. Those are the types of questions. We also have a cropping systems forecast model that forecasts corn and soybean growth throughout the state of Iowa, and it runs live during the year. And I'd encourage you guys to check out those websites. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any
absolutely,
questions.
Mike.
I see that
Jack and Rob had asked a question at about the same time
Should
a little
I go
while
right
ago,
ahead,
so I'm
Steve,
not sure
or
if that was
you have anything to
the
add?
context on that, but you can see Jack and Rob's questions and answer those, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So let's see here. So Jack's question, would the excess nitrogen in the spring help decompose the rye cover residue? To some extent, yes. So in situations with a lot of residual nitrogen left over in the soil, cover crops will indeed have a very low C to N ratio, and we have seen some enhanced rate of decomposition from that. And of course, I'd like to add that, those are great times for a cover crop when there's residual nitrogen in the soil that you want to hang on to. And it does. Another aspect I might mention real quickly here, Jack, relative to your question, is in the first year of this study, we compared paraquat and glyphosate as termination modes. And the idea was that the paraquat, we'd get faster nitrogen release and decomposition. And we could measure it, but we didn't feel like it was really an ecologically or economically relevant difference in that cover crop decomposition. But certainly we were able to measure it. Then Rob has a question here about what about cereal rye residue tying up some nitrogen after a corn planting because of the high C to N ratio of the rye residue? Yeah, so it's this idea that the rye residue can tie up nitrogen and reduce the corn yields because of the tie up in nitrogen. So here at Iowa State, John Sawyer has looked at that question, the nitrogen fertility extension specialist. He's looked at that question in pretty close detail. And his conclusion is that, adding extra let me say this more carefully. So the optimum nitrogen fertilizer rate following cover crop did increase on average a little bit, but that wasn't the cause of the yield decline in corn following a rye cover crop. So a difference in nitrogen input didn't explain that yield decline. They got the same yield, although a little bit higher nitrogen was required to even achieve the corn. I'm not saying this very clearly. The corn following the rye, it had a slightly higher optimum nitrogen rate, but it still yielded less than corn following no rye. And his conclusion, I believe, was that yes, the rye cover crop was tying up some of that nitrogen due to the high C to N ratio, but it could not be overcome by just adding more nitrogen fertilizer to the system. The other things were in the mix, things like pathogens, etc. I know some of the things that Tom Casper has been looking at with below ground processes. Let's see here. So I had cattle eating the cover crop in the corn stubble. How does using the winter cereal rye for forage in the early spring affect availability of nitrogen? So Tom, that's a great question. It's hard to say, but certainly grazing the cover crop would reduce that high C to N ratio tie-up effect that I just talked about. It also might allow the soil to dry out a little bit faster. So oftentimes folks are concerned about cover crop using water from the system, but now we're really water excessive environment in Iowa. We find that cover crop actually increases soil water content in the spring, typically due to a mulching effect. And that might be reduced with the cattle grazing. And so that may be an added benefit if you're concerned with too much water in the profile in the spring. And then finally, a question here from Bill. So am I saying that soybean will mine soil nitrogen if you don't add additional supplemental nitrogen in an organic form? And yeah, so that's exactly what I'm saying, is that our partial nitrogen balance on soybean in terms of nitrogen harvested in grain minus nitrogen fixation is consistently negative. In Iowa, my colleagues in Nebraska, it's consistently negative there as well, and also in Michigan. And so what that says is that more nitrogen is coming out in grain than the soybean is fixing from the atmosphere, and as a result, that extra nitrogen to offset that difference is coming from the soil, and that's as the soil is providing that nitrogen, carbon is being mineralized and lost from the system as CO2. And so without supplementing that nitrogen lost with some additional organic matter source that includes both carbon and nitrogen, it's the nitrogen balance will result in a negative soil organic matter balance over time. And so ways to offset that would be manure, other than liquid swine manure perhaps, and cover crops, right? Cover crops add more organic matter. They bring in the carbon from the atmosphere and they retain nitrogen that otherwise might be leached out of the system.
And Mike, actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but
Looks
you might
like
have
there
to
might
scroll
be
up. It
one
looks like
more
there was a question
question being
here,
entered.
Sobermesa Farm,
Not sure here.
that asked if there were any similar studies on an organic production system that you're aware of.
I am not aware of any studies on organic corn and soybeans in Iowa in particular. I know Ajay Nair in the horticulture department at Iowa State's done quite a few studies on vegetable production and cover crops, some with winter cereal rye, and just the challenges of terminating that
Okay, great.
cover crop in those
And
systems. I know he's been working
Margaret
on
Smith
those
had a
questions.
question just after that too about the nitrogen move below the surface where unincorporated residue resides.
Yeah, so has nitrogen moved below the surface where unincorporated residue resides? Um, Relative to nitrogen aiding decomposition. So I'm going to have to think about that one for a second. Does nitrogen move below the surface where? So, I mean, nitrogen, the inorganic nitrogen does move down through the soil profile and below the rooting zone. And once it's below the rooting zone, it's typically lost from the system eventually to waterways. That certainly the cover crop offsets that by rooting. And, there's a lack of research on cover crop rooting, but I'm sure in some of those really high biomass production systems that Jack was showing and our late terminated ones, I would be surprised if the cover crop roots are not down to a meter deep. And so that may also help to bring some nitrogen back up to the soil surface from those deep subsoils that would take longer for the corn or soybeans to access as they begin to root in the spring. So a question here from Heather. Could some of the corn yield loss that you describe after rye cover crop be due to cooler soil temperatures created by the rye residue? Some folks in Wisconsin have found that this explains some of the corn yield reduction. Could this be one of the factors that contribute to that corn yield reduction? And I think absolutely, yeah. I think, I think there are a lot of factors contributing to that corn yield reduction in corn following winter rye cover crops. My own personal opinion from reading through the literature and working on this a little bit is that most of that yield loss in corn following the winter rye cover crop is not due to nitrogen being tied up by the cover crop, and that simply adding more nitrogen is not going to offset that yield loss. And so things like Heather indicates here, cooler soil temperatures due to the cover crop biomass, that could be a very important factor. I know Tom Casper is working on root pathogens. Tom Casper at the USDA here, and he helps run the Midwest Cover Crops Council. He's been doing some work looking at root pathogens. That may also be a contributor. I know some of my colleagues at the Iowa Soybean Association this year observed significantly higher lodging after some severe storms in corn following a winter rye cover crop versus adjacent cornfields that did not have, that were managed identically except for the cover crop. And so that seems to be consistent with also with some rooting problem. Certainly the cooler soil temperatures would be a big limitation on rooting as well. So not only might they enhance pathogens, but they would also limit rooting depth and root front velocity in the early spring. Yeah, great and good. Stefan has some follow-up information as well for Heather's question.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. We've still got time for questions if anybody's got a question for Jack as well. Jack's still here, so think them up and put it in the chat box. And for those of you, I guess, who may not be aware, Stefan shared some research from Practical Farmers of Iowa. Stefan's the research scientist here that works with Jack and our other on-farm researchers, so he does know what he's talking about, I guess.
Stefan definitely knows what he's talking about. I want to so I want to add a piece to Jack's comment about the more open canopy architecture in corn and seeing if it improves cover crop growth. Some of those little tweaks that we're thinking about, when I didn't talk about cover crops other than the yield penalty in corn or the yield reduction in corn. I really didn't talk about cover crops in corn very much. But one of the things that I'd mentioned, if cover crops going into corn, things to think about, maybe the relative maturity for the corn, on fields, most farmers are planting 4 or 5 corn maturities. Maybe those earlier maturing fields are the fields to plant into if you can't get cover crops everywhere. Those would make sense if they dry down faster and allow more light in the canopy. So I'm really excited about that canopy architecture idea, and just anyway to get more light and more cover crop growth in there. Oh, so Tom's got a question. Are there any disadvantages of grazing cover crops by cattle in either the late fall or early spring versus not grazing the cover crop? And I don't know of any. In grazing systems, grazing grasses is well known to promote root growth too, and so there may be some advantages. I don't think there's enough research in that area to say. Bill's comment: more light equals more weeds.
Yes, more light is more weeds.
Are weeds a cover crop, Bill?
2 years worth of data that I've got. By the time the corn gets really tall, my cover crop had a good covering on the ground until it started to wilt and die for lack of light. So we'll see what happens, but I'm optimistic that the cover crops can help hold those weeds back.
Yeah, I'm really optimistic, Jack, too, that those cover crops can hold the weeds back. Like on this result we saw here with, as I said, I'm not sure how aggressive our herbicide program was, but it certainly wasn't nothing. And as one impact though of that extra cover crop growth that I may not have mentioned, in addition to some of those relatively low soybean yields we had there, they weren't terrible, but is that we noticed in the late terminated cover crop that the following year's cover crop, the germination wasn't
and
quite
my
as
results
quick.
were similar. That's what I was referring to those strips where I was talking about the SDS.
On the ground.
And that being the first year it ever had cover crops, so there was not a lot of decomposition of that, and so I didn't get a good stand of the cover crop where it was so thick.
Right.
Yeah, Jack, it looks like there's a question here from Tom for you. He's asking if you plan on interseeding cover crops in all of your corn at the V4 to V6
I'm still
stage,
investigating.
or are you still waiting to
I'd like to find
learn a
some
little bit
varieties
more?
that will survive in the tall corn before I spend the money to put it in early and watch it die. The bulk of it I'm still putting in corn. I'm putting it in late August. for the bulk of it, but I'll have these strips for another trial.
Yep, good to know. Well, looks like the chat box is quieted down. We do have time for another last couple of questions if anybody's got any. We got a lot of great cover crop experts in the room tonight. I don't know, otherwise, Mike or Jack, anything else that you'd want to add here that we haven't talked about?
I guess I'd just put the plug in that you already did, Steve, for PFI, and have more researchers to look at some of this kind of stuff. I think it's a great program, and
Excellent. Thanks, Jack. Yeah.
Yeah, Steve, I'd just like to add to Jack's statement that this is really good, and it's nice to get. I think it's nice to get some of the more research scale stuff in the same room at the same time with somebody like Jack who's working at it with a production scale, and so we can bounce ideas off each
Yeah,
other and learn
we're
from one
glad to
another.
have
I
both
think
of you
this is
guys
great.
here tonight. We really do enjoy having our on-farm research compared with university research and to hear about the results being discussed back and forth. So I guess now's probably a good time to go ahead and say thanks to Jack and to Mike for taking the time to prepare these presentations and to chat with us tonight and answer all these questions. And thanks to everybody for tuning in and asking good questions. That makes for a really good Farminar when we have engaged, attendees. So thanks everybody for joining us, and I think maybe we'll just wrap this up and stay tuned for further. There it is. Okay, so yeah, if anybody's still there, I do want to ask you if you could take a quick minute to provide some feedback in our survey. So I put this box up here that says please provide some feedback. If you click that, that'll link you to SurveyMonkey and you can give us the topics you want to hear about in the future and provide some feedback from tonight. Thank you.